In a world of constant change and innovation, trust is key, knowledge is power, and the inside track is everything. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bruce Whitfield.
Hello and welcome to Inside Track. A great pleasure to have John Loos, who is property economist at FNB, with us to review what has happened in South Africa's commercial property sector during 2021, and then to try and look ahead and get some sort of insight as to what may happen in 2022. If I'd asked you at the end of 2019 to forecast 2020, it would have been a very different perspective, I'm sure, John Loos. We'll get to forecasts in a moment, but give me a sense of, please, as best you can, as we wrap up the year of 2021, how things have gone in commercial property generally.
Well, there's still depreciation in values during the first half of this year. That's what we've got data for from MSCI. But the decline in values has been diminishing. Last year was the year in which the market took its biggest pounding, and slowly but surely we seem to be making our way back to where the all property average capital value will probably get to zero either late this year or early next year somewhere. But overall for this year, we're probably still in on average price or value decline. It'll probably be less than last year's decline. We're at about 9.5%, 10% overall decline in values since the decline started. I think the best way to put it is you're probably seeing some stabilization. But if you break it up, that stabilization in the market is probably more in the industrial sector and to a lesser extent the retail sector, but the office sector of the big three commercial sectors is still battling seriously.
It may battle for some time, depending, of course, on COVID waves and the way we respond to those COVID waves. How important is the interest rate outlook? There is no doubt that interest rates as we go into 2022 are going to change. We've had record low interest rates in South Africa for a considerable period of time, huge pressure in the United States to begin raising rates. Lots of indications are that the economy will be able to manage rates increases. And we see all kinds of economies all over the world with some really weird policy moves and fluctuations. But generally, I think the consensus is that 2022 is the year of the hikes.
It seems like it, yes. And First Rand, we certainly pencil in a very moderate rate hiking cycle. We don't think that the Reserve Bank's going to move quickly or sharply. They're mindful of the fact that this is a very fragile economy. But up seems to be the next, the trend to come in 2022. And that just takes any further recovery in this property market probably off the table, unfortunately. So we've recovered quite sharply out of the hard lockdowns of last year. As I say, that likely brings us back to where capital values are no longer correcting in nominal terms in 2022. But in real terms, probably the correction goes on still. In other words, you probably get very low, if any, capital growth in the overall property market. That doesn't keep up with general inflation. So, us economists, we talk about in real terms, therefore, the market is probably still gradually correcting. That's what I anticipate for 2022.
Because you don't get any major correction in even a slightly rising interest rate environment unless there is evidence of sustained economic growth. And this year is the year, a lot of people are offended by this, but it's too good to not use the dead cat bounce phenomenon. We fell so hard last year that there's bound to be a recovery this year. We'll probably get 5%, maybe a little more, on growth in 2021 versus 2020. And of course, after a 7% decline last year, we're nowhere near to 2019 levels. But that aside, the outlook on growth for 22 and 23, nobody's penciling in much more, I don't think, than 1.5%. And that's not a growth environment, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, the structural problems or constraints in the South African economy are well documented, and we're seeing that playing out at the moment in the form of quite widespread load shedding. With electricity supply or erratic electricity supply being one of those structural constraints. So, and apart from that, I think what people have to understand is that during that deep recession of last year, a portion of businesses close their doors. That's the production side of the economy actually shutting down. So our potential, our production potential across the whole economy has dropped somewhat, whatever that number is. And that takes some time before the business confidence, so the existing businesses that can take up that slack and can invest in capacity and replace that lost capacity, that doesn't happen overnight. Business confidence is low. Even the existing businesses still in business took a big knock, and so no one moves quickly to expand capacity and get this economy back to output potential above where it was, say, in 2019. So we're only expecting next year for GDP level, forget about growth, but for GDP level to get back to what it was in 2019. Now, if you take that to property, there was a rising all property vacancy trend before 2019 and during 2019. So if we're only getting back to a GDP level of that, that's not sufficient demand yet for commercial property, I don't believe, to turn that vacancy rate around and take it down. I don't think we're probably a few years away from that.
Right. So give me then an outlook, if you dare, in terms of 2022 and beyond, because it strikes me that value seekers, people who are looking to find decent pricing on great property, have got lots of options open to them. And that becomes the buyer's market, which forms a new base in a property sector in the aftermath of a crisis. And we seem to have a really good opportunity here to create that base.
I think there is a relatively good buying opportunity and probably doesn't diminish over the next few years. My best expectation, given what we're expecting, as you mentioned, Bruce, the economic growth rate slowing back to the 1%, that real sluggish economic growth that we were seeing before COVID-19, suggests to me that we're going to live with a high overall property vacancy rate for commercial as a whole for the next few years. Rentals stay under pressure, and capital growth almost non-existent, maybe very slow, and so in real terms, actually values are declining for the next few years. This is typically how property corrections often play out, is just a slow, real value decline over a good number of years, and given the structural constraints of the economy, that's what I expect. So it's probably a relatively good buying opportunity for the foreseeable future, not just for 2022, but there beyond, until such time as we get some sort of structural reform that economists like to talk about.
This is the most frustrating phrase. I mean, after unprecedented, which was 2020's most irritating word, the words structural reform in South Africa have been my biggest bugbear words of the year. And we've seen attempts at structural reform. We've seen politicians talk up structural reform and overemphasize perhaps the micro steps that have been taken so far, and some important steps that have been taken in terms of partial privatization of SAA and appeals for capital for Transnet, and more private sector involvement in the economy, which is long overdue. But if we're going to talk real structural reform, the sort of structural reform that is required to ignite meaningful growth, to get then the economy moving and the property sector moving too, what are the top 3 reforms that you would like to see happen in order to begin that process?
Well, I think for me, it's about it's not so much about specific reforms. There's got to be quite a sizable ideological shift to where if you look at South Africa, it's got some world-class sectors, banking being one of them, where there's highly regulated. It's not a free market, it's a highly regulated market, but a market nevertheless with very or significant degrees of competition. And we can perform in South Africa under such a model. Where you don't perform is normally where there's some sort of protected monopoly, often supported by the state and the taxpayer. Let's look at the electricity sector for one. So the ideological shift that has to come is to where government function must be regulatory. Well, good regulatory. Build up a good regulatory capacity, and the private sector delivers. So you might have a competitive electricity generation sector. The detail is obviously got to be thrashed out, but it's private investment in a far greater part of the economy, where government withdraws from trying to deliver the service to a regulatory capability. I think that's the big ideological shift that has to happen, because the taxpayer can't fund this big state sector at the moment. Government has too much on its plate, regulatory and private sector. So that's where we've got to go. I think that before that can happen, though, you've got to get to, there's a political change that's got to happen. We're going into the era of what often is messy coalition politics now. And, I'm not going to predict who's going to win or how things are going to change or what realignments are going to come from that. But it's a phase we go through where you struggle to get things done. So I think that any significant structural reform in the right way, in the right direction, probably struggles to get going until such time as you've got some new or changed political alignment which emerges as the dominant force and can, sort of push such structural reforms through, hopefully. So we've got a political period to get through. So, it's not going to be something that's on the table, or significant structural reforms anytime soon, unfortunately. And so we live with the structural problems that we know about. Electricity sector supply, which is erratic and increasingly costly, and the skills shortages, and so we go. Unfortunately, I think that's going to be around for the foreseeable future.
If a 100-meter stumble was a sport, South Africa could take that to the Olympics and win gold medals, because that's what we do. We don't grow, we don't surge, we don't run, we don't race. We stumble and we bumble along. We almost fall on our faces and we pick ourselves up and we keep heading towards the very, very distant finishing line of whatever race that we're running. You suggest that we're going to a year or two or more of the same.
I think so, yeah. At the end of the day, if you look at Britain in the Thatcher era, when Margaret Thatcher took over and implemented some serious structural reforms there, a lot of privatizations and all, of the mines and so on. She had to have a unified ruling party behind her that had the support of the public to stay in power. That's what's needed, a clearly, strong ruling party. And that's not, we don't have that here at the moment. And then she then had to put up with serious resistance to change. Humans, no matter who, they are resistant to a lot of change, because there's certain groups which will be marginalized by whatever structural reform it is. You privatize the mines, certain people are going to be marginalized who weren't before. And so there's a lot of resistance. Strike action. She faced a more than a year-long mining strike in the process, and she had to push through and not blink first. So, structural reform, when it happens, is a hard process. It's a rough process, and, certain groups will resist it. So, I think that one has to understand that even if we start to go in the right direction from an economic structure point of view and from a policy point of view, what economists would call the right direction, it still doesn't come without some serious battles and some serious turbulence in the process.
Thank you, John Loos, who is FNB's Commercial Property Economist. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Track. John Loos, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.